Today we're going to finish learning the 24th chapter of Tanya. Now, the 24th chapter of Tanya posits that every single sin is essentially an act of rebellion and sedition against God that is tantamount to idolatry. Because in every sin, I know it sounds ridiculous to you, in every sin we are essentially saying, I really don't care what you have to say, God, I'm doing what I want. You said I shouldn't eat this, I shouldn't go there, you said I shouldn't think this, you said I shouldn't say this, but I want to do those things. So, you know what, God? Have a nice day, I'll see you tomorrow. That obviously doesn't work. So I'm oversimplifying, but Alter Rebbe says that every sin basically is idolatry. Now, after we advanced that theory, the Alter Rebbe began a little bit of troubleshooting, because this seemingly outstanding statement doesn't jibe. It doesn't fit with what we know, what we think, and in fact, what the Torah itself says. Last week's troubleshooting was the fact that in the Torah itself, there is a discussion of certain sins for which one is required to give their very life, and certain sins for which one is required to preserve the life at the cost of committing the sin. So if every sin is the same, why is it when it comes to the sin of idolatry, of embracing a foreign deity, that we say you're supposed to give your life? And when it comes to the sin of eating a cheeseburger, we say, do what you got to do. It's not worth dying for a cheeseburger. I know some people say it's to die for, but no, it's really not to die for. And just eat the cheeseburger, and in the future, hopefully, you'll be able to eat kosher. It gets even worse when it comes to Shabbat, which is Shabbat is the defining hallmark of a Jew, and Shmirat Shabbat is such an important, critical component in our relationship with God. And yet, when it comes to Shabbat, we say, violate the Shabbat and stay alive. It's better to violate one Shabbat, keep many Shabbatot after. Why do we say it's better to bow to one idol and then bow to Hashem many times after? So the Alter Rebbe, in a word, said that this is a Gzeirus HaKosov. This is a scriptural decree. He demonstrates that one mitzvah is not really more important than the other. So it's a scriptural decree that we don't necessarily understand as to why certain mitzvahs we're required to give our life, and certain mitzvahs we observe them by violating them, because that's what the Torah tells us to do. So if that's true, how come the Torah speaks about the egregious nature of sins and the impact and the fallout of a sin in different tones? How can we say that some sins are so bad that they actually cut your soul off from God and could result in premature death? And in the Beis HaMikdash's times, they did result in people dying young or early. And other sins, you just bounce back. Or it seems you bounce back. Or there is no terrible consequence. Now, when it comes to positive mitzvahs, when it comes to things we're supposed to do, there's a very clear statement in the Mishnah that says that Hizar b'mitzvah kala kib'chamura. You should be just as careful with a little mitzvah as you are with a big mitzvah. And the Hasidic masters note that the Hebrew word hizoher, which means you should be very, very stringent, very careful, very scrupulous, is also related to the Hebrew word zohar, which means radiance or light. And it says, how does one achieve a luminescence of soul? How does one achieve a radiance, a light? And the answer is, b'mitzvah kala k'mitzvah chamura, small mitzvah like a big mitzvah. And it's noted mitzvahs, because we don't know the reward of a mitzvah. What seems to you like a small mitzvah may in fact be an enormous mitzvah. When is this approach somewhat correct? When does it have veracity? When does it hold water? When we're speaking about positive mitzvahs, because the Torah never really describes the reward of positive mitzvahs, or almost never. There are two exceptions: honoring our parents, shooing away the mother bird, and that's a question in and of itself. And you see the commentaries discuss it, that it's a kal v'chomer, it's like almost a fortiori. If a little mitzvah like sending away a mother bird, for sure, all mitzvahs will lengthen life. But then when it comes to honoring parents, no, it says it's actually literal, it does extend life. But as a rule, there are no rewards for mitzvahs discussed, which is one of those radical things about Judaism, where other faith systems speak about rewards all day. Some speak about 72 Virginians, and others speak about all kinds of things that are discussed, going to heaven and having a wonderful time, and if only you'll do these things, you go to heaven, don't do these things, you don't go to heaven. And the funny thing is, Judaism never talks about heaven. It's not even mentioned once in the entire Torah. Heaven is not mentioned, Gan Eden is not mentioned. It's not even like an issue. What's talked about in the Torah? Here's what you're supposed to do. Why? Because Hayom La'asosam. This is about now. This is not about tomorrow. Now you're supposed to do what Hashem wants. Tomorrow, don't worry. He takes care of you. Rambam says that's one of those principles of faith, essential principles of faith. There are 13 pillars of the Jewish faith. You got to believe in all of them. One of them is char va'inish. There is reward, there is punishment. Ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu mekapeach schar kol ber. Your God doesn't overlook anything. If you do something good, it will result in goodness. You do something bad, there will be a consequence. Rest assured. But the Torah doesn't talk about it. It's not relevant. It's not an issue. That's not the focus. The focus is not our slice of heavenly chocolate cake. The focus is doing what Hashem wants, making this world a godly place. When it comes to negative mitzvahs, though, the positive, the things we're not supposed to do, not the things we should do, the things the Torah tells us don't, which are actually more so than the things the Torah tells us do. Only 248 of those things are do's, 365 are don'ts. The Torah does specify the consequences. And there are some sins which are so heinous and so egregious that a person could forfeit his life. Sometimes in an earthly court when we had an ecclesiastical judicial system, sometimes in the heavenly court. So how could you say that every sin is the same? Torah itself says every sin is not the same. Torah itself tells us that every sin does not have the same impact and that the wages of sin vary. And just like the same way people do different jobs, they get paid different salaries, so it is also, you do different sins, there are different wages earned. These are bad wages, but nonetheless, different. So how do we work this out? So in order to understand the last portion of this 24th chapter of Tanya, I think I should tell you a little secret. And the little secret is that we have a cable that connects us to God. And the cable car metaphor is that each and every one of us has a rope, a thick cord that bonds his soul onto HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as is encapsulated in the verse that was articulated by none other than Moshe Rabbeinu himself on the last day of his life. He said, Ki chelek havaya amay, a portion of God is his nation, Yaakov chevel nachalaso, Jacob is the rope of his inheritance. And the way it's explained at great length in Chassidus, especially in Igeres HaTshuva, which we're going to start learning next week, we talk about this notion that the rope, we metaphorize a rope that is woven of 613 very thin strands. You ever seen a thick rope? You go down to the water, you see these thick ropes on a boat, yeah? So those ropes are made of many, many small strands. But when you put all the little strands together, none of them is as weak as they would be on their own. When they're all together, all of a sudden there's enormous strength. Which is anyway a little message about Jewish unity and about if we're woven together, nothing can break us, and we're very strong. But each of us on our own doesn't really have that much strength. The strands are very, very weak. So what happens is, if a person were to want to sever one of those ropes, you got to work pretty hard. You can't just simply, twist and sever it. You have to cut through many, many thin strands. Eventually, if you cut through enough thin strands, you will start to sever the rope. Every mitzvah is like a strand. Every mitzvah. We have 613 methodologies, conventions that connect us to Hashem. Every one of them, when it's in place, makes sure we get connected. To use a more modern metaphor, we could talk about a fiber optic wire. And these cables today, these electronic cables, they look very much like a rope. They're made up of many, many thin wires. And if you cut one of those wires, it probably won't impact the functionality very much. You'll probably still get the picture on your screen. If you cut enough of those, eventually you'll have dysfunction. The energy will stop flowing through. And now, it seems to me this is actually a more apt metaphor, but it didn't exist 300 years ago, so Alter Rebbe doesn't talk about it. But really, if you think about it, it's the same thing. Only here you see like there's vitality, there's energy that's flowing through, and the energy is lost. So, there are some sins which are considered to perform the equivalent of cutting the mainstay, of somehow getting through the primary wire, the main artery. And there are other sins which are considered to be just kind of superficial. Violating these sins doesn't actually sever the main cable, doesn't sever the main wire, and that's why we can go on. So moving forward now, the Alter Rebbe says that there's a cardinal difference between the act of sin and the post-mortem of sin. So just like in the physical material reality, when a person is gripped with a tremendous lust and desire for sin, he imagines the sin to be so delightful and so wonderful and so amazing. Every fiber of his being is on fire. He just needs to get a hold of that sandwich, and that nothing's going to stop him till he gets it. And then what happens after you finish eating it? It's not so good. For this I went crazy. For this I traveled across the world just was it so nice. And you try to convince yourself, it really was an amazing experience. It was so great. It was so great. I'm so happy. I have such a great life. I had so much fun. And you say to myself, I kind of feel empty right now. Okay, I need the next thing. I got to go to the next pleasure because this pleasure is finished. This pleasure didn't last very long. But the next pleasure, now that's going to be something stupendous. It's going to knock everybody's socks off. We go on to the next thing. And every single time before the Aveda seems absolutely unbelievable. Can't wait to get there. And then when a person violates the Aveda, he's like kind of almost regretful. Like, wasn't even worth it. It wasn't even good. It wasn't even fun. What did I do that for? Many years ago, I counseled a very unfortunate soul who had committed adultery, and he violated his marriage, he ruined his family. And he said to me once, it was never worth it, he said. We used to hide and do these things and whatever. It's never worth it, he said. It was every single time I said, what did I do that for? Well, it's so stupid. Like, I have to just get back to my normal life. And he said, and then the seductive nature of sin would pull me in, and I'd do the same thing all over again. And every time I would say it was never worth it. It was never what I imagined it would be. But this is the nature of sin. Well, guess what? That physical material reality that every one of us could relate to is a reflection of how things are in the spiritual reality as well. Which means, when you're doing the sin, it's terrible. When you're actually doing the sin, you are standing up brazenly, rebelling against God. The question is, what happens after the sin? Well, after the sin, after the sin, the Alter Rebbe says, if it's the kind of Aveda that doesn't come along with a karas punishment, karas is that big fat cut off, the main gets shut off. So it doesn't have misi b'dei shamayim, it doesn't have what we call premature death or a sentence imposed from heaven. Where the soul doesn't die entirely, which of course would be a reflection of what happens on high. On high the soul dies, so therefore the soul dies below. It gets cut off from God of life. It's been somewhat damaged. The rope is damaged. The signal's that much weaker. You're not so connected and bonded as you were before because of the sin, because b'chetzeh. However, having said that, even though it's true that the sin does have an impact, but in the post-mortem analysis of the sin, the material or even almost corporeally powered existence of a person, which comes from not the godly soul, but comes from the nefesh hachayunis, which comes from the natural soul, a vital soul, which is actually in the body, which becomes, if you will, fleshed in, and one's actual corporeal existence, it bounces back. It does bounce back. It becomes close to the holiness of the godly soul, which actually powers it, which is embodied in it. Deep down, of course the person believes in God. You go over to the person, you believe in God? Of course I believe in God. Well, why are you doing what you're doing? Well, Yetzer Hara, Nefesh HaBahamis, the evil inclination, the animal soul got the better of me. But you believe in God? Of course I believe in God. You are a proud Jew. Are you kidding? I will do anything for my pride, my Jewish pride. I'm ready to fight for my Jews. I meet people like this. I'll die for being a Jew. Yeah, but why? So why are you doing this sin if God's so important to you? And God said don't do it. Well, it's not such a big deal. I got to live. I'm just human. Or some other narishket like that. But the truth is, after having done the sin, which was a terrible act of rebellion against God, really, they don't remain where the sin is. They come back to normalcy. They come back to where they are. And so after the sin, what happens? The person bounces back. It's really very much like people getting an injury. And what happens if you get an injury? That happens invariably. The injury heals itself. Most of pharmacology is not really necessary. Most of pharmacology, and I know you're a doctor, but tell me if I'm wrong. Most of pharmacology speeds things up. Most of pharmacology enables the body to heal itself more quickly, sometimes artificially, but most things, the body will heal itself. True or false? No, the doctor says it's true. Most times the body will heal itself. Now, of course, there's the odd chance that strep throat could kill somebody, and therefore it's not a good idea to play Russian roulette. And if we have penicillin, by all means use the penicillin and use whatever methodology you could to help the body along, to get the body to heal itself. But the body is a remarkable thing. You look at these Holocaust survivors. These people were more dead than alive. a few months later, the body had put itself back together. It's actually remarkable. I've heard some survivors that said themselves, I don't even know how my body put itself back together. I can't even believe that I looked normal again. I didn't think I would ever be a human being again. Flesh torn away, everything was nothing left. It was like the people were not functioning. It bounces back. Now, there are some organs you can't bounce back from. You get a bullet in the leg, you can bounce back. A few months ago we had this guy who spoke, who was in this terrible accident. Every bone in his body was broken, right? The guy's looks normal now. He's living a normal life. Now, there are certain vital organs that if they get bludgeoned and beaten in that fashion, you ain't coming back. Like if your brain is splattered in different directions, you're finished. It's not possible. If your heart's torn apart, that's it. That's what we call a vital organ. So most of the body can put itself back together. Some parts of the body will never be able to put themselves back together. And if the injury is there, that's what we call a fatal injury. So it is also with the neshama. There are some sins which are considered to be absolutely fatal, and the body will not be able to put itself back together. There are some sins which the body, so to speak, bounces back, and the neshama, the body reconnects itself to the soul, because that's who we really are deep down. And because we really are a Yid, and we really are connected to Hashem, and because the neshama is a chelik elikam, it's a piece of God, so we somehow, things repair themselves, and we come back together. There are stories of people in the time of the war who were left for dead. And people found that decades later they survived, and nobody could really explain how exactly they survived. But somehow, it's like by the grace of God and the incredible miracles of the human body God created, they saved themselves. And then there are certain times where the doctor will tell you with absolute certainty, had we not been there with triage, had we not done what we did, there is no way on earth this person could survive. It's not possible. We did save them. It would not have been possible. Without the miracles of modern medicine, it would not be possible to save them. Okay, so the metaphor for this is that if you do tshuva, it's possible to undo the impact of kares. Even kares. Even the sin that says you die prematurely, it's possible to repair the soul. But for this you need triage. For this you need some very heavy metal kind of serious treatment. And that heavy metal treatment is known as tshuva. And tshuva, when it's fully unleashed, has nuclear capability. It's not conventional. Tshuva is unconventional. So conventionally, the person is finished. However, if we use unconventional methods, it's possible for the person to come back. I would say this is the metaphor of somebody who got injured in the brain, or an injury in a vital organ from which you cannot come back. Save a miracle. There's no humanly possible reality that this person should survive. It's just according to nature, it can't be. But the doctors did. The Gemara talks about, God forbid, a child born prematurely. The Gemara says it can't live. But today babies are living. Well, conventionally it can't live. With modern technology, things which are unconventional are happening. Maybe this is even a forerunner of a glorious messianic time where all of a sudden the conventional reality won't make a difference to us. Who says it can't be through the explosion of technology and the development of the natural sciences that Hashem gave us the intelligence to use? So in non-conventional methods, yes, it could be used. And so it is also with the neshama. There are non-conventional methods, which is the idea of tshuva. And the notion that tshuva is a non-conventional method is captured in the following medrash. So chachma, they said to wisdom, what should happen to the sinner? So the chachma said, the sinner should die. It's like you ask a doctor, what should happen if you eat a pound of cyanide? What will the doctor say? You will die. That's what happens. The sinner dies. You cut yourself off from God, what will happen? You'll be dead, says chachma. Oh, they don't like that answer. So they went down to Torah. Said, Torah, what happens if somebody sins? So Torah said, somebody sins. Yasa tshuva, yavi karban v'yiskaper. You'll bring an offering, and then you'll be able to atone yourself, right? Because the offering will be such an incredible infusion of strength that will save you. So it may be the equivalent of get a blood transfusion. Transfuse all the blood, which is an amazing thing to do, very difficult. You pull off a massive transfusion, person can live again. And then Shalu HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then they asked God, what should happen? God said, Yasa tshuva. He says, do tshuva v'yiskaper, and Hashem forgives him. In other words, this is the idea that's not conventional. Torah is still conventional to some degree. Wisdom is wisdom. Torah is Torah wisdom, godly wisdom. It's super conventional, but still within the frame of conventionality. And then we speak about God, and that's nuclear. This is already quantum physics. All bets are off the table. Nobody knows how this ends. So Hashem says the power of tshuva is so intense that when a person does tshuva, it simply erases everything. and you could live. Now, I should really tell you that there are two parts of the Jewish soul. It says Yaakov Chav Nachlase. There's the Jacob part of the soul, and then there's the Yisrael. Afal Pishechata Yisrael. We don't say Yaakovu. The sin only impacts the Jacob dimension of reality. It can never impact the Israel dimension of reality. The Israel dimension of reality lives for eternity, and nothing can snuff out that spark of godliness. The Jacob part of the soul can be lost entirely. Unfortunately, you can't just live by Yisrael, you need Yaakov too. So, in the case where the person cuts off, at least in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, a time where everything functioned along the lines of the spiritual reality, and the spiritual reality and the material reality were not disconnected, if a person would do this terrible sin, he'd get kares, he'd be finished. Having said that, the truth is that when a person does tshuva, this is already unconventional. Unconventional things can happen. Going back to our point here, a person who does a sin that's not a kares sin, does he need to do tshuva? The answer is, of course you need to do tshuva. You always need to do tshuva. And if you want to be able to repair your relationship and you want to be able to enhance and deepen your connection to Hashem, you need to do tshuva. That's without a question. However, on a literal level, if you don't do tshuva, will you die? Will you stop functioning as a Jew? The answer is, no, you won't. Just like earlier, the Alter Rebbe said, that most people who do wicked things are filled with regret, which means that they can always sort of pick up where they left off and start to do mitzvahs again. And then he says there's some kind of Russia, the serial murderer Russia, who's so dark in his soul, who's so messed himself up that he can't pick himself up. This is what we call a person's like an addiction. He knows it's bad, he knows it's wrong, he cannot pull himself out. How does the addict have to, what does he need? He needs to hit rock bottom. This is what the Alter Rebbe said earlier in perek Yutes. Alter Rebbe says that a person is in such a bad state, that person has to, so to speak, do a full shvira. He has to, literally, the only way is to break the enamel, the shell of indifference that he built around himself. Only then could he serve Hashem again. In other words, without doing tshuva, he can never come back to any kind of avodas Hashem, because he's so sinful, because he's so steeped in sin. He's a Rasha Gomer. He has no conscience anymore. It's very rare. Most of us have a conscience. Most of us are on the range of Russia, but, not like Rasha Gomer, not totally wicked. So we have these regrets. And we do bounce back, and we do experience glorious moments of spiritual connectivity, magnificent frames of elevation, and we feel close to Hashem, whether it's the end of Yom Kippur, whether it's the Pesach Seder, or during the shofar blowing, because we're not far gone. Because the truth is that the fallout, the wages of most sins are not so steep. Well, as I said, some averos are very, very bad. Some averos, some sins are so bad that you actually can't bounce back, that they actually cost you your life. But see, here's the point, here's the problem. Remember, the Alter Rebbe is like troubleshooting, because whenever you introduce something new, and this is like really a radical new concept pioneered by the Baal Shem Tov, developed by the Maggid, and ultimately articulated and fully fleshed in by the Alter Rebbe and Tanya. So what the Alter Rebbe says here is somewhat unconventional. Nobody ever heard such an idea that every sin is idolatry. What do you mean every sin is idolatry? He's an idolater. I'm just a regular sinner. I just, eat food that's not so kosher sometimes. Or I just involve in Devarim B'Teilim, and I just didn't daven today, but I don't do any idolatry. I'm a proud Jew. And the Alter Rebbe just told us every sin is the same. And that flies in the face of everything we know and learn. Like, how could that be? So the Alter Rebbe here makes a major distinction between the act of sin, within that frame of when you're sinning, and then the post-mortem. The post-mortem is a world of difference. A world of difference. In other words, think about time as you can within a film. Remember in the olden days when there used to be actual film, you could see film, take film, like a motion picture, there's thousands of feet of film. You take the film and unfurl it, and what do you get? Frames. Each frame is like a millisecond. The frame is a frame going like this, like this, like this, like this, like this, like this, like this. Put them in speed, all of a sudden what do you get? The hand is moving. Okay, that's the simple science of motion picture. Now it's very, very sophisticated, now it's all computerized, but that's how it all began. So within a certain frame, you can only exist within that frame. Now think of it this way. When you're sinning, it's a certain frame you're in. And every frame of time is eternal. Before God, the past, the present, the future is all one. So each frame is eternal. When you're doing that sin, that frame or collection of frames, you're sinning. When you're actually sinning, what are you saying to God? God says to you, don't. And you said, I will. What did you say to God? I don't care what God has to say. I am not interested if God said I should or shouldn't. Now I'm interested in what I want. It's little me time. I had enough of God time. Enough of God getting in my way. Enough of Him butting into my life. This is my life, not His life. And I'll do whatever I want, and I'll deal with God later, okay? And if He can't understand that, that's His problem. Oh, really? Yeah. It's your life. Right? Like, exactly what did you pay for it? And what did you do to earn it? Like, really? Like, are you sure about this? And if a person is so rebellious and he does terrible things, then this frame, the fallout of this frame is so bad that actually he can't put the pieces back together. So some sins like idolatry, boom, that's it. You severed yourself. Your neshama is not going to be able to live on afterwards. And tshuva could change things, so that's unconventional, but it requires an enormous splitting of an atom, or maybe a tiny atom, but an enormous event of tshuva. Tshuva is atomic. Tshuva is literally off the charts. And we have all these stories of people with lives of sin, and then in one moment a person could do tshuva. There's a beautiful story told that Friedrich Rebbe was once in Vienna, and he was accompanied by a group of local German Jews to the train station. I don't know, he was traveling. And they're very, as you told me, if I was German I would never be late for my classes, right? But I'm not German. So anyway, the Germans, Jewish, not Jewish, very punctual. So this group of German Jews, they came to the train station, and one of the German Jews looked at his watch, and he said, "Ein Minute, noch ein Minute, just one more minute, the train will be here." And the Friedrich Rebbe finished the sentence, and he said, "Ken noch tshuva tun." In 1 minute, you could still do tshuva. It doesn't take hours, doesn't take weeks, it takes a minute. It's like conventional warfare. To destroy this city, it will take us 3 weeks. A nuclear bomb, 1 minute. Because it's non-conventional. Tshuva is the ultimate non-conventional. It's the ultimate spiritual quantum physics. So the fallout of sin is going to be different. Of course the fallout of sin is different. Of course there are some sins for which you chayiv kares, or misa b'deshamayim. Of course there are some sins that cut you off from your source. However, that's only some sins. That's not all sins. In other words, the question was, how could the Alter Rebbe say that every sin is a violation of the essential principles of my relationship with God, and it violates the very essence and the very currency of my relationship? It's not so. What's the answer? Well, you're right. In the fallout, in the post-mortem, subsequent to sin, there's a huge difference. However, in that moment, Alter Rebbe says, when I told you it's like idolatry, I'm speaking about that moment. So if you zero in and focus on that frame, at that moment when you ate the sandwich or bowed to the idol, you do the same thing. You said, I don't care what God says right now. And Alter Rebbe goes on to describe this. He says, even though the nefesh hachayunis, the animal soul, was deeply involved in sin, and it schlepped along the godly soul, as he continues to say. V'gam b'shas hachet, and even at the time of sin, paraphrasing Megillah Esther, hoisa ba'amna iti yisbarach. The person was still loyal to Hashem. So Esther, even when she went by her own volition, it would seem, to go and to be with Achashverosh, even then she was still loyal to Mordechai. She never really abandoned her people. But if you take a look at that frame, it would fit into a great X-rated movie. It was not exactly a mitzvah. It didn't look like Yom Kippur night, right? So there's a terrible sin. Look what? No. It didn't make a difference. Esther never. These are all superficial realities. The truth is, she always remained loyal. Now the same thing is also with the neshama. The neshama always remains connected to Hashem. The neshama has to be involved in the eating of the bacon. Why does the neshama have to be involved? Because whatever the body does, the neshama does. Like we said with the rope, you pull the rope on the bottom, it shakes on the top. It's not possible otherwise. You didn't have you can't like put your neshama in the locker and then do whatever you want to come back and claim your neshama after. If you put your neshama in the locker, you're dead. It doesn't work like that. Life necessarily requires body and soul to stay together. Now, the truth is, deep down, even when a person is doing the wrong thing, deep down, they are loyal. There's an incredible halacha in Hilchas Gittin. Now, there's some guys in jail for this halacha. But the halacha goes like this. If a person doesn't want to give a get, man doesn't want to give a get to his wife, the get is not kosher. However, there is a way to get him to give a get. What's that? Get him to agree. Beat him up. He said, that's crazy. Beat him up. Why should you beat him up? Why? Because he's a lowlife. That's why. Because he's an SOB. Because he's tormenting his wife. Let her go. It's not going to work. The marriage is not going to work. Give a get. That's the Torah thing to do. There's many movies about it. The whole thing is terrible and misunderstood and so on and so forth. We cannot change the essential principles of how the bonds of marriage work. However, people can elect to abuse the realities of Torah. So there are people who do that. But the question becomes, when he said, I'll give the get, he didn't really want to give the get. What happened? He forced him. So this is not a kosher get. Now if the courts force him, it's taka not kosher. Secular courts force him. But if a Beth Din gives a ruling and they force him, it's kosher. Why? So the Rambam says very simple. He says, this is not just a Gemara, sometimes the things in the Gemara, but this is a halacha. It says very simple, the reality is that kol echad ve'echad miYisrael roitze, every Yid deep down wants to do all the mitzvahs. So if it's a mitzvah, if the Beis Din said it's the right thing to do, why is he doing it? What got in the way? His Yetzer Hara, his animal soul. What happens when you beat him up? His Yetzer Hara got weakened. You explained it to the Yetzer Hara. Now that you explained it to the Yetzer Hara, he says, that's what you mean. Okay, now I'm ready to go along. Now I understand. Now I understand. But in other words, the basic operating principle here is this has to be real in halacha, is that ultimately what does every Yid want deep down? To do the right thing.
Why does that not apply to other mitzvahs?
Who says it doesn't?
No, go beat someone up, keep Shabbos.
Why doesn't it?
Why
why doesn't it apply to other mitzvahs?
Why only specifically for that?
No, I'll tell you why. Because here there's a poor woman who's chained and she can't go on with her life. I have no right to go beat somebody up to do a mitzvah. That's not what Hashem told me to do. He said to influence him, inspire him, engage him. Here, there's a woman who's never stuck. I have to save this woman. What should I do? I beat up this guy. Now, if he was doing a sin which didn't affect her in that way, whatever, okay, it's sad, it's unfortunate. Say a kapitel tillim. Pray for him, give tzedakah for him, try to influence him. You understand? That's the problem here. You're chaining somebody else. It's not an upper hand or a lower hand. If you understand the essence of marriage, which I don't have the time to talk about now, then you would understand that this is the way marriage works for a variety of reasons, and call this a side effect. Because of this is the way marriage works, this is the reality that engenders. And it's unfortunately that people are bad and sinful and abuse it. I have to tell you, I know so many men who are desperate their wife should accept the get, and they don't want to accept the get just to spite them. So it goes two ways. It's a two-way street, by the way. It's not simple at all. Lo pashut. Okay, but that's not the subject at hand here at all. So what happened then? If the neshama was always connected, listen to this. The Alter Rebbe says, and here will help you understand your question. You can't get your head around this idea. How could it be idolatry? You know what happened to the neshama? It went into the biggest exile you could possibly imagine. In the animal soul from the Sitra Achra. Hamachtia es haguf, which makes the body sinful. It brings the bodily reality, the corporeal, the spiritual, the metaphysical, and the soul itself into the lowest abyss. Lamata mata, lower and lower, tachas tumas sitra achra, lower than the lowest sitra achra, as we discussed earlier in the perek. How you become lower than a gnat, lower than a mosquito and a bloodsucker. The klipas avodah zarah, lower than a klipa avodah zarah, Rahman al-San. Why? Here's the Alter Rebbe gives a graphic example. He says you should know ein lecha golus gadol mezeh. The biggest golus is when a yid chooses to sin. That's the biggest exile possible. It's me'igra rama. It's paraphrasing the pasuk in Eicha that we take it from the heavens, like it says in Eicha. It says hishlich mishamayim aretz. We're thrown from the very heavens, thrown down to the earth. Even the greatest fall possible, like the Gemara says, from igra ram, from the high summit to the lowest valley. So therefore, this is really, on a literal level, this terminology is used to describe the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash and the Golus, the exile of the Shekhinah, of God's presence. However, microcosmically, Chassidus says that the same applies as to every single neshama. An act of sin is a minor destruction of a Beis HaMikdash. It's a driving away of God's presence. It's an act in which we bring the neshama into the greatest Golus possible. Like explained earlier in the second chapter of Tanya, that the source of the souls is from the highest level of divine consciousness, the highest level of the divine psyche. God, blessed be Him, His wisdom are one, and that's what the neshama is. And what happens when you do a sinful thing? There's no greater embarrassment, no shame, no greater chagrin. Even if it's only momentarily. You know what the metaphor of klipa, of sitra achra, of these dark forces are? The metaphor that's used is a cesspool. Ki tsoya kanoida. A cesspool. Oh, a cesspool is before we had fancy toilets that had running water and perfume spraying in the air, so you didn't really have to know how lousy a bathroom is, right? Like when I was in Russia, in 1994. I found out exactly what a cesspool is. Right? When you have to go to the outhouse in the winter and you have to relieve yourself into a pit of, I don't want to discuss it anymore, use your imagination. Now imagine taking the king and throwing him in there. The king, the most respected person in the whole world, and throwing him into the cesspool. You'll take him right out after, don't worry, you send him to the showers after. But for a moment, can you imagine the shame? Can you imagine, could the degradation get any worse? Well, that, my dear friends, is what happens at the time of sin. And so, the Alter Rebbe has fully defended the thesis. Are sins different? Most certainly. Where's the difference? The difference is in the post-mortem. The difference is in the impact and the fallout subsequent to sin. However, during the act of sin itself, an act of rebellion, an act of sedition is an act of rebellion and an act of sedition, regardless of how egregious, severe, or simple and minor it might be. Minor infraction or major infraction, the fact is when a person sins, he turns his back on HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Lucky for us, most things we can bounce back from. Even without tshuva, and when a yid does tshuva, Allah's kama v'kama, he's able to reclaim the Yisrael Shabbat and amazing things can happen. So the bottom line is, this chapter of Tanya should not depress you, it should inspire you, it should make you feel good, it should make you realize that no matter what you do, you're still connected to Hashem. However, to be fair, it should make you realize the egregious nature, how bad sin is, how terribly devastating, how painful it is for the neshama. And like, they say in Yiddish, have rachmanis on your neshama if you don't want to have rachmanis on your body. Have a little pity on your soul, have pity on HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Because every time you do an act like that, it's very, very hurtful, it's very painful, even if subsequently, indeed, it is true that you have enough soul power and enough reserves to be able to bounce back and continue along in your Avodas Hashem. You have a question?
Thank you. If you allow.
Yeah, why don't we set these people free on Facebook and then we can do your question.